All right. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. This is the inaugural meeting of our Tillamook Working Group for DLCD's National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Estuarine Resilience Action Planning Project. Quite a mouthful. I'm Michael Moses. I'm coming to you live from my dusty garage in Corvallis. And I go by Michael, Mike, Moses, hey you, stop that, whatever works, I'll respond to it. I often go by Moses, as many of you have noted. Michael's a very common name, so it's one way for people to remember who I am. And I will toss to my co-partner, my lead on this project, Heather. She can introduce herself, and then let's go around and just have everybody introduce yourself, who you're with, and where you're coming from.
Hi everyone, I'm Heather Wade. I'm the Coastal Policy Specialist for DLCD and the Oregon Coastal Management Program. I have to keep my video off for this meeting because I keep getting kicked off of my meetings this morning. I have an unstable internet connection, so I apologize about that.
And Colin, how about you go next?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Colin Jones with the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership. Just started a few months ago. I'm the Habitat Assessment and Monitoring Coordinator, and I've been working with Moses on this, and I really look forward to seeing where this planning process goes.
Thank you. The next person on my list is Celeste.
Hey everybody, Celeste Lebo. I'm working with the Institute for Applied Ecology right now, but I've been working for, I guess, the last decade on the North Coast, and I think every job I've had has included Tillamook County. So, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces.
Thank you. Jocelyn Burnside is next on my list.
Hey everyone, Jocelyn here. I work for Tillamook County Creamery Association. I'm the Director of Environment and Community Impact. And so I help with our philanthropy programs, funding projects like food security, healthful children, and agricultural advocacy. And then our environmental, which spans farms as well as our processing facilities.
Thank you. And then I believe Casey.
Yeah, good morning. This is Casey Story. I also work at Tillamook County Creamery Association, the Natural Resources Manager, and our field service team. I help dairy producers with regulatory compliance and stewardship projects.
Thank you. And Katie.
Hi everybody, I'm Katie Volke. I'm the Executive Director with North Coast Land Conservancy, and I've worked there for about 16 years. I'm joining you from Nehalem. We are a land trust. We do land conservation in Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, and just in the last year or so, I've gotten a little bit more involved in Tillamook County, so it's nice to be involved in this.
Great, thank you. Leanne.
Hi, my name is Leanne Welch, and I am now the city manager for the city of Bay City. And I agree with Celeste, it's great to see so many faces that I've worked with over the years. So thanks.
Great. Mike?
Hi, Mike Sandin, General Manager at the Port Garibaldi.
And Sarah?
Morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Weissler. I'm with Trout Unlimited. I'm the coordinator for the Salmon Superhighway project, and I know most of you and work with a lot of you. We're working on reconnecting aquatic habitat in the Tillamook, Nesteca, and Sand Lake watersheds by removing in-stream barriers.
Thank you. And last but not least, Zach.
Yeah, hi, I'm Zach Mallon. I'm the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council Coordinator. We do all the usual Watershed Council things, from riparian work to tide gates. And so, yeah, you know, Watershed Council stuff.
Important stuff, Zach. Thank you. Well, like I mentioned, we have a few other folks who will be participating with us throughout, but they just weren't able to attend today. So we have Sherry Vick from Tillamook Soil and Water Conservation. We got Robert Bradley from ODFW, and he has one or two other compatriots that I think they're going to kind of share the load there. I'm probably forgetting, but I think we may have one other person. And we're certainly not an exclusive group. So if there's anyone else throughout this process that you feel that we should include, please let us know, and we'll do our best to reach out and try to include that person or their group. So as I mentioned, I'm Michael Moses. I'm with Department of Land Conservation and Development. It's an Oregon State agency. I am the Estuarine Resilience Coordinator. So I've been tasked with coordinating this project, which Heather and I crafted back in 2020 when we were all getting sent home from the office. And so we subsequently were awarded the grant. It began this summer, and it'll conclude on May 31st, 2023. Just a little background on myself. Prior to this position, I was with DLCD for about a year and a half. I was working on the Rocky Shores process. I don't know if any of you heard about that going on, but we were working on updating Oregon's Territorial Sea Plan Part 3, which is the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. So how we manage all of our rocky habitat resources. So everywhere within the state territorial waters out to 3 miles, anywhere that salt water touches rocks. So that's what we were working on. That process is still ongoing, but it should be wrapping up pretty soon. So I think they just had an OPAC meeting a week or two ago, and they're looking to wrap that up. Prior to that, I've done all kinds of things for the last 15 years or so in sciences. I started out thinking that I was going to study birds in headwater streams in the Coast Range. So I did a little bit of that for about 4 or 5 years. I did various kinds of field work. And then I turned my sights further downriver. And so I've been focused on coastal systems ever since for about the last decade or so. I've done a little bit of everything from post holing through the mud in the estuaries to working on the rocks at 3 in the morning to working out at sea on OSU's research boats. My specialty has really been in estuarine ecology, as well as seawater chemistry. So I did my master's research at OSU in marine resource management, focused on chemistry and how we get professionals to learn about complicated subjects like chemistry and apply that in planning work and resource management work. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm employed as a planner, but that's not really my training. That's much more Heather's wheelhouse. So she's going to be helping me throughout with the planning side of things, making sure I'm doing that part right. And then we're going to lean on you folks a little bit throughout this process to give us your expertise, your skills, your local perspectives, and represent stakeholders to the extent that you're comfortable to help design this process and formulate this plan. All right, so I'm going to move ahead here. All right, quick overview for today's meeting. I'm going to apologize up front. I think this meeting is a little more packed than we might expect in the future, just because it's our first meeting. So unfortunately, I'm going to torture you a lot with just me talking at you, trying to cover all of our bases. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time to ask questions or clarify something or contribute. It'll give me a break, save my voice box here throughout. But today we're going to start with welcome and introductions. Then I'm going to touch a little bit on the goals, where we're headed here. We need to think about when we want to meet in the future. Then I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project. I think most of you I have met with individually. So you probably have a good sense of this, but I wanted to make sure that we just did a quick overview anyway. Our focus is going to be on natural infrastructure, our nature-based solutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And then we're going to transition to looking at Tillamook specifically, what's been going on in Tillamook. We'll hear from Colin a little bit about Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and their work. And then we're going to, the last whatever bit of time we have, half hour, hopefully, or more, it's just going to be kind of an open discussion about just brainstorming what's already been done and where we might add value and how we might approach assessing the resilience needs for Tillamook County. And we'll try to adjourn by 11. If earlier, that's fine too. So really our objectives for today, though, is to update you on the process, our plan going forward, and focus on natural infrastructure and really start to have that discussion of how we want to approach this project. So in the future, we'll just have a standing meeting and we'll just provide updates, and it'll run as long as it runs. So real quick, just in case, I'm sure we're all very familiar with Zoom by now, but just in case anyone is not, a few tips for navigating Zoom meetings. So there's several buttons that you may see there. You can mute or unmute. A tip there is you can press the space bar, and as long as you're holding the space bar, it'll unmute you temporarily, and then you can release the space bar to remute yourself. Video is not required. So if you don't feel like being on camera the entire time, like I'm going to be, don't worry if you turn your video off. I won't feel bad. You can view the participant list or chat list here. The meeting is being recorded. If you ever have an issue with that, let me know. There are reactions, so if you'd like to raise hand, go ahead and raise hand. But feel free to just speak up as well. I don't mind being interrupted. And then if anyone wants to utilize the chat function to ask questions or to share links, please feel free to do so, and one of us will catch it from you. You can also rename yourself in the participant list if you need to do so. All right, a quick overview of our goals here. So we have project goals and working group goals. So our project goals is, overall, looking to develop an estuarine resilience action plan for Tillamook County estuaries. We want to make sure that we include a broad spectrum of stakeholder perspectives and that community interests and needs and concerns are really encapsulated in this plan. We also want to cultivate relationships in Tillamook County. DLCD wants to make sure that we are maintaining and cultivating good relationships throughout Tillamook County. And it always helps for all of the participants as well to establish those connections. I'm glad to hear that lots of you already know each other. That's seems to be something that happens a lot with coastal issues in Oregon. It's not a very big community, it seems like. So that's always great that people already have those relationships established. We want to build on previous work. So a lot of planning has already been done in Tillamook County. I know a lot of that you folks have been involved in, so that's great. That's part of the reason why we reached out to you. So aim for project completion by May 31st, 2023. That's when our grant expires, barring some sort of extension, which I don't think will happen. And then, ultimately our goal here is that we'll identify some resilience projects, and then they will advance or reach completion following conclusion of this process. Our working group goals, of course, then is to guide development of the action plan. It's up to us to really define and refine the steps of this process. So I don't have it all figured out. There's no prescription necessarily here. So that's where you folks are really going to be helping us drive this process to say, well, this is what we need to do. This is what's already been done. This is how we can add value. So in that way, it'll help us shape and review process materials. So our project deliverables, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And then provide technical perspectives using the best available information. So all of you are here today because you have very specific skills and experience that will help this process. And so whatever those are, you contribute them in the best way to your ability and capacity. And then, of course, represent local interests and concerns. So I'm not personally from Tillamook County. I'm a native Oregonian myself, originally from the Portland area. But I've not spent my life and my career in Tillamook County like many of you have. So that's where I'll really be relying on you to tell me what Tillamook County needs and wants. All right, so our first order of business is we're going to need to set up a standing meeting. So for me personally, I think that this will help the process move along smoothly and kind of take some of the pressure off of myself to build up to, just a very occasional meeting. But if we have a standing meeting, then we can just provide regular updates to one another. And if we meet for a half hour or we meet for 2 hours, whatever the group needs, I think will be fine. But I think we should reserve a regular day of the month with a 2-hour window that we can meet to update each other. And this way too, if anyone ever can't attend a particular meeting, then they're not going to feel too bad, because they know that they'll get updates from me, and then we can just meet with the group again next month. So I sent out some materials. Hopefully you've had time to look at them. If not, I understand. It was kind of a lot because this is our first time meeting. But I talked about this in there and threw out one suggestion in that document. And so I thought I'd present to you that option and a couple other options, at least that kind of worked with my schedule. I don't know if it works for everyone's schedule, and it might not. But I thought it would be good for us to kind of decide, or at least have a quick discussion about when we might want that to be. So these are my suggested options. Kind of in order, I guess, for preference for me personally, but if anyone has any thoughts or feedback about that, let me know. What does everybody think? Would one of these options work for you? I imagine everybody's kind of checking their calendars right now, but if we don't make a decision today on this, that's okay. We can facilitate it over email, but I thought we should at least try. So Leanne says in the chat that they all work for her. Okay, Katie doesn't, Thursdays don't work for Katie, okay. How does the first Tuesday of the month work for everyone in the morning?
Yeah, that works for me.
I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, and like I said, if we set something and it doesn't work for someone, you can attend the next month, or alternatively, we can always change it. Celeste, okay, thank you, Celeste. Katie says not till 9:30. Sarah, okay. Yeah, if we do the first Tuesday of December, that might be a little too soon. It seems there's some conflicts there. So maybe what we can do then, we'll send out an email to everybody kind of figuring out what works. I didn't suggest Wednesdays because our agency tends to have big meetings on Wednesdays. But that's once a month. So, and I didn't really want to do Mondays or Fridays if we didn't have to. And would Wednesdays, say the first or second Wednesday of the month, work for anybody? Or Heather, can you tell us, DLCD, our staff meetings, are those, I think that's the third Wednesday of the month. Am I off on that?
I think that sounds about right, but I know that they are talking about actually changing those to be quarterly meetings again.
Oh, okay.
So those are subject to change.
Looks like it's the second Wednesday. How would the third Wednesday of the month work for anyone?
That works for me.
So that would be, the first one then would be December 15th, if we did it that way. And I'm suggesting mornings because my kids come home at 2:30 in the afternoon, so.
Yeah, it looks like that works for, I think, everybody.
Okay, we could do third Wednesday of the month from 9 to 11. And if anyone decides later that that doesn't work for them, we can always shift it. But I will work with my coworker to set up a standing Zoom meeting and calendar appointment, and then I can send that out to everybody. And then if there's ever an issue, we'll just rearrange things. All right. Okay, so our first mini presentation here, just a general overview of National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and our Estuarine Resilience Action Planning process. So the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NFWF, they are a nonprofit organization established by the U.S. Congress to re-grant federal dollars, primarily from NOAA, to a number of priorities. So one of those is the National Coastal Resilience Fund, or NCRF, and that's who's funding this process. And they award based on one of 4 focus areas, which you can see across the top there. So Heather and I applied under this new focus area that they had when we applied, which was the Community Capacity Building and Planning. And what the National Coastal Resilience Fund looks to do is increase resilience and reduce risks from things like storm surge, flooding, sea level rise, tsunami, climate change, water quality impacts, etc., to meet the needs of local coastal communities. They seek to engage key partners and stakeholders in the planning process. So local government leaders, citizen groups, federal, state, tribal regulatory agencies, emergency management organizations, resource agencies, etc. They're focused on describing criteria and methodology to be used in identifying specific resilient sites, approaches, and projects. So with the ultimate goal to result in communities being well prepared to advance sites assessment planning, design, and other stages for resilience activities, and be better prepared to seek future funding. So really they look to for natural infrastructure projects that'll increase resilience, whether you're at any stage of implementing that project. So when they implemented this new focus area, it's for very early stages of planning. And that's why Heather and I applied under that focus area, thinking that, well, if local communities need to plan for these projects to improve resilience, whether they're at whatever stage they're going to be at, whether it's site design or permitting or breaking ground, none of that happens without good planning up front. So we figured it would be good to pull folks from the communities to help us develop those plans, to outline clearly in a report, what it is that they need to do, what the benefits and costs are of those particular activities, and what it's really going to buy them in terms of resilience. So our project focus is going to be on outlining those resilience needs and priorities to advance their status, particularly those activities which are already in early planning stages, to make them appealing candidates for potential future funding, whether that's from NFWF under one of these other priority areas, or whether it's from another funding source. So while this project might focus on planning for specific projects that haven't yet started, I think anything that's maybe already in one of these other stages of progress could be included in our process as well, to say, well, we're doing site design for this particular project, but we're going to need funding to when we get to the point that we break ground. So we can put that into our process here and hopefully plan for it. So that's where we come up with estuarine resilience action plans. Sorry, I'm spinning multiple plates here on my screen. So here's on the left, you can see this was from our original grant narrative, some examples of chronic and episodic hazards in Oregon coastal communities. I'm sure all of these are things that you all are familiar with to some extent. So DLCD is looking to develop estuarine resilience action plans. We proposed for two coastal jurisdictions, a North and a South Coast representative jurisdiction. So Tillamook and Coos County, respectively. And the goal of the plans is to identify and outline the needs, goals, and priorities for these natural infrastructure projects to increase resilience to the impacts of all of those hazards you see there. The work will identify priority sites for conservation, restoration, anything that's going to improve estuarine ecosystem function. So we decided that we need to not bite off more than we can chew. And much of the major vulnerabilities along the Oregon coast are within the estuarine areas, which also happens to be where the majority of the coastal populations reside. So we thought we had the most to gain, the most benefit to plan for resilience projects in estuarine areas. The geographic scope then is going to be anything within Oregon's coastal zone. So that's from the crest of the Coast Range all the way to the waterline within Tillamook County for our part of this process. So although the focus is going to be on the estuaries, the project area might extend beyond the estuarine areas if you, the working group, identifies adaptation options that will meaningfully improve resilience within that given estuary. So Tillamook County, of course, is home to 5 of Oregon's estuaries: Nehalem Bay, Tillamook Bay, Netarts Bay, Sand Lake Estuary, and Nestucca Bay. The mouth of the Salmon River is also partially within Tillamook County and may be included in the geographic scope if the working group decides that there are priority estuarine resilience needs in that estuary. Our focus will be on identifying specific nature-based solutions to improve resilience in any of these estuaries where there's a demonstrated need. So if the working group determines that no actionable resilience needs in one or more of these estuaries exists, then we can document that and no further action needs to be taken. So for example, if the working group decides, well, there's just no priority needs within the Sand Lake estuary, for example, then we can summarize that in our action plan, but then we don't need to focus on planning particular projects for it. And we can focus our energies elsewhere on other estuaries and other priorities. So our approach here, you can see, is to be bottom up and community driven. That way we represent local concerns. Like I mentioned, DLCD, myself, don't necessarily know all the needs and concerns for Tillamook County. So that's where you folks are really going to help us out there. But DLCD will play the role of facilitator and coordinator, while you folks representing your organizations can really help lead this part of the process. We're going to try and engage multiple stakeholders. So besides everyone that's present here today, throughout this process, there will be other opportunities to engage community organizations and leaders, municipal governments, academia, the general public, and others. We'll be assisted by technical expertise. So that includes you folks. We also have a project partner with the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement at the University of Oregon. They're especially helping us down in Coos County. We also have the Oregon Coastal Management Program, which is a network of state agencies, which is led by DLCD. So we have many partners there, such as ODFW, Department of State Lands, the Watershed Enhancement Board, and many others that we can lean on for technical assistance. And any other partners that have relevant skill sets or institutional or local knowledge. It'll leverage existing and anticipated planning efforts so many of the plans, such as the TEP work that's been done, are things that we're really going to try and build on rather than duplicate efforts. It'll be scientifically grounded and guided, leaning heavily on that existing planning work and other literature. And this is a pilot process, so that's something to be aware of, that this hasn't been done before. So this is something that we're really testing out in Coos and Tillamook counties. Each plan will be tailor-made for their jurisdiction, so they might not resemble one another at the end. And we're really looking to fill in planning gaps with this process. And at the end of it, we're going to evaluate our process, say what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better in the future. And we'll find that, and then pending funding and staff capacity in the future, we'd like to roll it out to all the remaining coastal counties. So the estuarine resilience action plans will be structured in 3 phases. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the meeting briefing document, at some point, please familiarize yourself with it. Kind of walk through this quite a bit. But our 3 phases here are estuarine resilience needs assessment, our activity analyses, and the goals and priority setting. And I'll talk about each of those real quick here. So phase 1, this is where we're really going to focus on identifying community needs. We're going to establish the local context for resilience by identifying local needs and priorities, by reviewing plans, engaging stakeholders, facilitating community feedback, all with the intent to identify and describe potential resilience activities that focus on the estuarine areas, which are outlined in the state estuarine management plans. Resilience activities, what I mean by that is projects or other actions which improve estuarine resilience. So anything that may include buffers against flooding and sea level rise, protection and restoration of coastal wetlands or seagrass beds or other estuarine habitats, something that might improve water quality or air quality, changes in upland land use planning, natural infrastructure improvements, and inclusion of any other factors that will improve resilience for social, economic, or community elements. So we actually have pretty broad scope in terms of what we could potentially do. So I'm trying not to be too prescriptive here, and that's something that we as a group are going to go along and figure out what Tillamook County really needs. So DLCD is going to help coordinate outreach and engagement to make sure that we have some of that community input and help the working group provide a technical perspective throughout. So how we go about those things, though, is something that we're all going to need to determine together. Phase 2, this is when we're going to assess potential resilience options. So it'll focus on technical assessments, evaluating the impacts of potential resilience activities. And at the end of that phase, try and characterize a menu of adaptation options that will help us reduce the negative impacts from those hazards. So potential activities will be evaluated for things like project costs and funding, logistical requirements, anticipated social, economic, or environmental impacts that of the identified needs from phase 1. So the coastal local governments may assist with outlining the feasibility of project site planning, cost points, potential funding, these kinds of things. And at the end, a menu of potential adaptation actions will be assessed in a stakeholder adaptation action workshop to determine our final list of projects. So in phase 1, we're saying here are the needs and priorities for estuarine resilience in Tillamook County. And then we start to brainstorm some potential actions we can to address those needs, evaluate through phase 2 what those actions will do for us. So this is our way of figuring out where our priorities are, and then put on an adaptation action workshop with local community stakeholders to help them tell us, say, here's our list of options that we can do. what in your from your perspectives do you think is the priority, and how should we prioritize this list of actions, and what should we move forward to plan for, and what should we not? So then phase 3, once we have our set list of these are the projects that we want to plan for, that we want to pursue funding for, if need be, we'll start to shape resilience project goals and priorities to move forward with those activities by outlining clear benchmarks and timelines to achieve individual project goals and advance them towards completion. So we'll determine those priorities using scored criteria that we will develop, ideally categorizing those to align with the estuarine management plan areas, and construct them in such a way to push communities and resilience project forward to advanced stages, so that those stages of site design, planning, permitting, restoration, and monitoring. And so with one goal there being that maybe we can get future funding from NIFWIF for some of these projects if we've already outlined things in this way. So we'll delineate timelines with project-specific benchmarks for each of those and impose them on yearly time scales. For example, to say, well, in year 1, we'll try and accomplish site design, and within 18 months we'll get it permitted, and within 2 years, we'll be breaking ground or something like that. So the end goal is that all 3 phases will constitute a completed estuarine resilience action plan with clear next steps for resilience projects that we've outlined, and that ultimately we've really teed up the ball here for targeted funding. So one thing we still might incorporate in this process is evaluating potential funding sources and how we might articulate our plans to target the requirements of those funding sources. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. So our desired outcomes here, we have some short-term and long-term outcomes. Short-term, looking for local jurisdictions and community partners able to have an improved understanding of the coastal resilience threats, vulnerabilities, and needs within their jurisdictional estuarine areas. The action plans will enable coastal jurisdictions to understand the scope, the impacts, costs, and benefits of potential resilience activities, and be able to prioritize them based on a variety of planning contingencies. And then, of course, be empowered to implement coastal resilience projects. Long term, we want local communities to be well poised to craft proposals for funding. We want estuarine communities to be able to meet multi-year resilience goals with their plans, projects, and activities advancing. The completion of the estuarine resilience action plans will be integrated with current planning efforts to the best of our ability. So things like the natural hazard mitigation plans, and advanced progress maybe down the road on updating our estuary management plans. So eventually then all coastal jurisdictions in Oregon will be empowered to participate in this process, hopefully, and develop their own ERAPs. Partnerships and support. So here for Tillamook County is a list of some of our commitments and partnerships for this process. Again, looking to have it led by local community organizations in partnership with municipal governments and Oregon Coastal Management Program technical staff and partners. For Tillamook County, our lead partner is Tillamook Estuaries Partnership, and DLCD will be lead coordination throughout the project to engage communities, delineate stakeholder partnerships, and facilitate public input. So part of that is establishing this jurisdictional working group to help with our core work. We also outlined in our proposal that we would have a secondary group, which we called review committees. So this is just a loosely consolidated group that will contribute to local perspectives, identify needs and priorities, and review some of our draft products. So on occasion, I'll reach out to some of these other partners. So this is folks like local planners from cities, other local organizations that maybe aren't represented here on the working group. And they can review our draft products. So, when we're heading towards the end of one of our phases, hopefully we'll have a completed draft of that part of the plan, and we can send it around to them and say, this is what our working group has come up with. Can you give us your perspective? What are we missing here? What do we need to change? Or what maybe is misrepresented, and just to clarify that and have a stronger product. Other partners may be identified and included throughout. So if any of you see a gap here that identify, like, well, we really need to have a partner participate in this process that you haven't mentioned yet, please let us know, and we'll reach out and try to make them get them included in the process. And then, so I did mention the first bullet point there, the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement. So I have a program at University of Oregon that focuses on planning for disaster resilience, doing vulnerability assessments and this kind of thing. And they received a grant through FEMA. It's the Coordinating Technical Partnership Grant at FEMA, and that's to help them plan for vulnerability assessments in Coos County. So we're trying to leverage some of their work down there to help us develop our estuarine resilience action plan in Coos. And their timeline is just a few months ahead of ours. And so what we're going to try to be doing here is try to test things out in Coos County and then try and replicate them a little bit in Tillamook County to the extent that they apply in Tillamook. So there'll be a little bit of learning curve here for me as we're figuring this out in coordination with IPRE down there, and then we'll try and do what works in Tillamook County. So that's going to be things like assessing vulnerabilities, evaluating adaptation actions, and especially those adaptation action workshops, which at this point I believe for Coos are planned for March of next year. So we'll be running those down there, and then when we get to that point in our process in Tillamook, hopefully I'll have a really good sense of how we're going to do that, and I'll be able to coordinate with all of you on how we want to adjust that for Tillamook County. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. So I know that that was a lot of stuff to throw at you. I'm going to get a drink of water and pause for any questions before we move on to green infrastructure. Well, if there's no questions, I'll keep going. So next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about natural or green infrastructure. So you probably all have a pretty decent idea of what it is I'm talking about, but I wanted to run through a few slides here just to make sure everybody understood what we mean when we say green infrastructure. So natural infrastructure is a proven and cost-effective approach to mitigate coastal hazards. The components vary, but the basic premise stays the same: slowing and absorbing floodwaters by redirecting water, reducing wave height, and attenuating wave energy. They also serve to create coastal habitats and protect sensitive species, among many other benefits. The components might vary from coastal wetlands and marshes to oyster reefs, beaches and sand dunes, coastal vegetation such as seagrasses, permeable pavements and bioswales, green roofs and rain barrels, incorporating natural areas into city designs and other planning efforts. So it can also help mitigate non-flood related hazards as well. So the focus is often on flooding, but it could also be things that address water quality issues, air quality issues, excessive wind, heat, or drought. So think broadly, and we'll try not to limit ourselves to focusing solely on flooding. Although for Tillamook County, understandably, that might be where the majority of our focus is going to be, and that's totally fine. So some benefits from natural infrastructure. It can buffer storm surge. So natural areas such as dunes, oyster reefs, mangroves, wetlands, they could protect storm surge by buffering waves and absorbing additional water. It improves water quality. So incorporating bioswales and permeable pavements in city designs that can filter runoff from roads and parking lots before it enters and streams and rivers. It can reduce erosion. So I know that's a big concern on the Oregon coast. We can plant vegetation along hillsides near waterways, which will reduce sediment flow that can harm aquatic life or exacerbate flooding problems and erosion. It adds a little bit of green to the gray. So incorporating it into city designs with things like permeable pavements, rain gardens, bioswales, and other natural areas can alleviate pressure on stormwater systems by removing harmful chemicals and excess water. So I know Rockaway Beach right now is having a big issue with their stormwater system there, their sewer system. So maybe we can come up with a solution there. It can protect upland property. So storm damage reduction potential for marshes is well documented. One study found that salt marshes reduced nearby property damage by 20% when compared to property where salt marshes had been lost. It protects wildlife habitat. So protected and restored wetlands provide important migratory bird feeding grounds, as well as other wildlife habitat, and serve as important nurseries for fish and shellfish. It can promote a healthy lifestyle. So in addition to flood protection, wetlands and green spaces provide recreational opportunities for things like hiking, kayaking, bird watching, fishing, etc. It's aesthetically pleasing. Natural infrastructure just looks better. I think most of us could agree with that. Living shorelines with shorebirds foraging for dinner along the coast win over a hardened shoreline any day. Same is true for grassy swales, parks, green areas in cities. It can improve the economy quite a bit. Tourists are drawn to recreational opportunities and aesthetically pleasing locations, and so are new businesses. So natural infrastructure can often translate into big bucks for local economies. And allows everyone to participate. So from whether it's a rain barrel at your house to wetland restoration efforts, natural infrastructure is an idea that can allow for everyone to participate, from homeowners to businesses, students, municipalities. Anyone can get involved if it's well designed. Let's see. And Celeste in the chat says, I think it's great how many times you have built in a process for reaching back out to the local community for input. Clearly, a lot of thought has gone into this effort. Thank you, Celeste. I really appreciate that. We do know from management literature that having local folks, local stakeholders, local interests drive these planning efforts in coordination is really produces some of the better outcomes. So that's really what we are trying to focus on. So natural infrastructure, there's some fundamental community and site design concepts for it that I wanted to run past everybody. So some of these concepts, natural areas and open spaces should serve multiple functions. So successful green infrastructure practices incorporate multifunctionality. So things like recreation plus stormwater storage or filtration, etc. They connect people to open areas and help provide a sense of place. That's very important for many Oregonians, of course. Potential project sites should be placed in the context of the greater community. They should preserve and enhance natural features by mimicking or enhancing existing hydrology. I'm sure many of you, maybe our Watershed Council partners especially, could really speak a lot about that. And they use urban streetscapes to provide ecosystem benefits in urban areas. So urban areas, they should, for an example, they should minimize impervious cover, enhance bioretention and filtration, and they should offer a return on the investment through ecosystem services and benefits. So there's a few different ways to categorize natural infrastructure projects, and they're on the right side there. So they're natural or nature-based, hybrid or non-structural. So natural solutions are focused on enhancing natural areas and features. They break offshore waves, attenuate wave energy, slow inland water transfer, increase filtration. And there's some examples of those there. So hybrid, so they have a blend of natural and structural features. So it's they derive benefits from both practices that way. So these are things like the permeable pavements, the bioswales, green roofs, rain barrels, natural areas incorporated into city designs. And then there's non-structural. So these might be changes to floodplain policy and management to make them more adaptive, including plans like comprehensive plans, transportation and growth plans, watershed and conservation plans, the hazard mitigation plans, climate change adaptation, land use planning, and of course, resilience planning. So all of these things fall under the category of natural infrastructure if those outcomes and benefits are the ultimate outcome. All right, so there's some potential barriers, of course, to implementing natural infrastructure projects. And they can fall into a number of categories that you see outlined here: technical and physical, financial, legal, regulatory, community, and institutional. So we're attempting to overcome some of these barriers in our process by focusing on increasing understanding and awareness, providing data that demonstrates benefits and costs of resilience activities, increasing technical knowledge and capacity of our planning partners, increasing planning capacity. So that's where I come in, serving as the coordinator for this project, trying to understand the risks of potential actions and connecting communities with one another and with state agencies and groups like Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and all the organizations that you represent. So that's a lot of this that's outlined here on the slide that says these are the barriers. That goes into some of the thought behind how we'd like to run this process. So those are things I'd like for you to keep in the back of your mind, and that's why we're doing it with this working group here to help guide the process. And then lastly, some funding sources. So none of this happens without dollars behind it, of course. And it seems to that more often than not, that funding isn't already in place. It's something that people have to seek out and try and secure. So with that reality in mind, throughout this process, that's really where we're going to be trying to aim for is at the end of it. Yes, we'll have some projects outlined here and what they're going to buy us, what they're going to do for us, what the benefits will be, and what it's going to look like to execute those projects. But really none of that matters if it can't be supported through funding. So we're going to really try and keep that in mind throughout the process to say, well, if we do this kind of a project here, our best bet is to target, say, FEMA or NIFWIF to fund this kind of a project. And in that way, we can outline our plans for that project that will articulate well with the requirements to achieve that kind of funding. So one of the ways we might do this, for example, is that FEMA has their BRIC and natural hazard mitigation grant funds. And so one of the ways that they fund projects is they say, can you demonstrate that there has been a repeated history of the hazard? So for example, floods. So I think in the case of, say, Tillamook Bay, we do have a repeated history of flooding there, and we can quantify that for them. And so that's something that we might integrate into planning a particular project for that estuary. And then that way we really set up our partners when any of your organizations or a state agency or whomever goes to say, we'd like to move forward on this project and we need to apply for this funding to get it. We already have everything that they need, or maybe much of what they need laid out in this estuarine resilience action plan. So in that way, we're trying as best we can to tee up the ball to make sure that these projects get funded and move forward. So for me personally, at the end of the day, you know, if we plan for a half dozen projects that everybody thinks are really feasible and really achievable and meaningful, and some of those receive funding and move forward and break ground, I'm going to be very thrilled if a few of them actually get implemented. But you know, hopefully everything we plan for will get done eventually. So this is just a list of some potential sources. There's many, many more. I included some links in the meeting briefing document to some other resources. And one of those was a NOAA resilience website that has all kinds of resources there. And I believe through that portal, it helps identify some places you can locate funding for natural infrastructure projects, coastal resilience type projects. But that's something that we'll be talking about throughout the process. So I'm going to pause there again before we move on to the next section. And if anyone has any thoughts or questions or comments, please let me know. Jocelyn in the chat says you could add NRCS, EQIP, RCPP, CIP funds as well. Lots of green infrastructure related projects, these funds. So that's great. Thank you. Any questions or thoughts or comments? Like I said, I'm going to be doing a lot of talking today, and I apologize for that. In the future, I'll try to have more back and forth for updates. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then I will forge ahead. So I'm going to talk a little bit about planning for resilience, what kinds of things have already been done, what's being done currently. So I covered a little bit of that in the briefing document. I provided you some summaries of some of the planning work that's out there that I know a lot of you folks participated in. And so in many ways, you know a lot more about it than I do. So please feel free to chime in on any of those things and let me know, you know, some of the greater context and more details about those efforts. So we're looking at having this our planning effort here, you know, kind of minimize the amount that which we're duplicating work that's already been done. We really want it to complement all the work that's being done. And there's been a tremendous amount of great work done to plan for hazards, plan for risks, vulnerabilities, threats in Tillamook County. And so we really want to make our work fit in nicely with that. So this is a short list you see here of existing planning efforts that we might build upon to complete this process. A lot of that work has been done to understand what are the stressors, what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the sensitivities and the impacts in Tillamook County. And many of these plans outline adaptation strategies as well. So we will focus on outlining and evaluating specific projects, specific adaptation actions that we can do to address all of those stressors, threats, vulnerabilities, et cetera, that exist in those plans. And if we need to, through our process, if we've identified additional threats, vulnerabilities, risks, sensitivities that need to be identified and evaluated and understood better, then that's what we will do to kind of build upon some of this work. So one I wanted to talk about real briefly was the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan. So this is a process that is funded through FEMA, I believe, and DLCD does a lot of this work in coastal jurisdictions to craft the natural hazard mitigation plans. So the NHMP, in my view, really helps tee up the ball for future resilience funding through those FEMA grants that I mentioned, the BRIC and the natural hazard mitigation grants, because they emphasize community priorities, identifying specific hazards, the costs and benefits of specific projects, and potential mitigation actions. All of these need to be articulated for potential funding. It also fulfills FEMA's goals of using the natural hazard mitigation plans as coordinating documents to crosswalk planning. That's a big priority for them. So if we are demonstrating that we're doing that, that's going to help us all the more. So it'll be focused on projects that are not yet started, as I mentioned, whereas the FEMA funding is focused on projects that are not yet started, whereas our process could be the projects could be at any stage of development, as I mentioned, but you know, because of the funding that we might target, we might focus more on projects that haven't yet begun. Additionally, the FEMA grants, they operate on a pass-through grant structure. And what that means is that they grant the money to local governments and organizations, or they grant it to state governments, and then local governments and organizations can't receive those funds directly. They have to apply through the state agencies and work directly with them to receive the funds as subgrantees. But they must have already adopted a natural hazard mitigation plan in order to do so with projects described to be eligible. So some of those other plans, I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, have worked on them, contributed to them, so you're probably more familiar with them than I. I spent a lot of time this summer reading all of those cover to cover and making highlights and notes for myself. And now all of those details are kind of a lost in an ocean of details. So so please feel free anytime throughout this process to help me remember what some of those details are. You know, some of these already I do some of the work that Heather and I had already envisioned doing from the get-go, which is identifying vulnerabilities and threats. So a lot of that's been done and is in these plans. And so I think for our process, we probably won't have to spend a whole lot of time in phase one doing comprehensive vulnerability analyses. We might just go in and part of our conversation here in a little bit will be to brainstorm what hasn't been assessed and what we can assess in the early phases of this process. Some of these plans also outline potential mitigation projects or actions. So one like is the Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative Strategic Action Plan. So they did a great job, very similar to what we have in mind for this process of saying, well, here's where all the needs and concerns are, and here's a list of specific actions and projects we can take to address those. And they even went so far as to outline some cost points for those projects. So very similar. However, most of those were hard infrastructure projects. So I went through and there's just a 2 or 3 of them that really kind of would fit this process of focusing on nature-based solutions, natural green infrastructure solutions. So that's one way in which we're looking to complement all this other planning work, is by saying, okay, you've done a great job, you know, focusing on where we might need, you know, to add more concrete or riprap or whatever, I don't know. You know, all that hard infrastructure planning, which is all great and necessary, but we want to focus on the nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure, and so we'll be, you know, a lot of you folks are going to have better ideas of what those solutions are going to be and how that fits into all of this other planning work and the needs and the vulnerabilities for Tillamook. All right, so I'm going to take a break here and throw it over to Colin, who is just going to tell you a little bit about Tillamook Estuaries Partnership. I'm sure you're all very familiar already, but I thought it would be good for us all to hear some of the work that Tillamook Estuaries Partnership has done, is doing, plans to do in the future. So Colin, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Moses. So, you folks might be more familiar with some of this stuff than Moses. You also might be a little more familiar with some of this stuff than I am, since I started at TEP only a few months ago. But there's a few things that have been brought up. The vulnerability assessment for Tillamook County, and sort of related to that, because that was something EPA required as TEP was rewriting our comprehensive conservation management plan. And so the vulnerability report was really a big partner effort, as most TEP projects are. Really good report on sort of what might happen and what we might need to do, but not a ton of sort of specific steps or specific projects outlined. And I think this ERAP process, the resilience action planning process, really might the next step between what are the vulnerabilities and let's actually get some work done. A couple projects that TEP has going on right now that are related to estuarine resilience, that I just want to touch on briefly. One is down in the Sand Lake estuary, the Sitka Sedge project. This is on Oregon Parks and Rec Department land, and TEP is the step we're in right now is sort of an alternatives analysis for potentially breaching the dike there, putting in a new setback levee, working pretty closely with the folks who live in Tierra del Mar to see what we can do to mitigate potential flood concerns. So doing tidal reconnection and tidal restoration work on the south part of Sand Lake estuary, and also making more sort of resilient infrastructure along the way. So that's a pretty exciting project, which we're working on getting some alternatives analyses done for. The second one that's a combination of some green infrastructure and some hard infrastructure is on North Coast Land Conservancy land in the Tillamook River wetlands project. So this is 3.5 miles up from the estuary along the Tillamook River, and it's reconnecting a big section of wetland there to the Tillamook River in this tidally influenced area, over a road that is failing, and anyone who has driven Burton Fraser Road knows that it is not going to last all that long, no matter what. So there, it's an interesting opportunity to do some green infrastructure of tidal reconnection. Getting these wetlands back, these sort of tidal wetlands back, with all the good benefits for native species restoration, and also potentially some more water storage as well, which is always nice. But a big part of the financial aspect of that project is working with the county to do something about potentially failing infrastructure of Burton Fraser Road, whether that is rerouting a new road to connect Netarts to 101, through some of the forest land that's higher up and much less vulnerable, or doing something to try to repair Burton Fraser Road to make it more resilient. So a couple of really cool things that are going on right now. And having talked with several folks here on this call, I know there's a ton of other really interesting work that partners are doing as well. Some tide gate removal, restoring some wetland access there, looking at replacing old culverts that might be failure points in big storm events, anything like this that has really awesome restoration benefits as well. So yeah, that's a couple things I have to say.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, the tie gate issue reminds me too. So I reached out to the folks at NIFWIF, and I was hoping to get a response before our meeting today, but I haven't gotten it yet. So it's still up in the air. I asked them, is removing tide gates, does that count as a natural infrastructure project? Because it'd be, of course, restoring or reconnecting these tidal areas. They said they weren't sure. They're going to ask and ask around and get back to me about it. So for the moment, that's potentially on the table. But that's one of those things that that could be an easy win for a natural infrastructure project. All right. So I mentioned about the FEMA CTP grant a little bit, probably too much too soon, but here I had a slide reserved for it anyway. So this grant, so again, this is being led by our partners at the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement at University of Oregon down in Coos County. So the project, there's quite a bit of overlap between our project and theirs. One is that they're doing community listening sessions early in their process, and for Coos County, they're mostly finished this already. They were doing it this summer. And so this was their way of assessing vulnerability and threats and needs and concerns in the local communities down there. So given that a lot of that planning work that I covered has already done these kinds of assessments to some extent, we might not have to do community listening sessions, at least in the same way as they're doing it. But it might be something that that we will plan for here in the next few months to have some sort of meetings or sessions or town halls to make sure that we're getting that community feedback so that we know that we've captured all of those needs and concerns to be addressed in this process. So to that end, we may leverage the methodology that was used down in Coos County. They are, of course, like I said, using that to identify threats and vulnerabilities. They're evaluating those vulnerabilities. So again, that's something that we'll do to the extent that we feel is necessary to add value to what's already been done in Tillamook. And then the big one that I think that we're going to leverage is the adaptation action workshops, like I mentioned. So this is going to be toward the end of phase 2. At least as it stands right now. This is something that, that timeline that I included in the briefing document, I'm leaving that a little bit to the working group to massage as they see fit. So if you think like, well, we should really kind of rearrange some of these tasks, that's totally fine. But the adaptation and action workshops, I think will work best toward the end of phase 2, when we've kind of narrowed the scope to say, here's 10 or 15, 20 projects, whatever, that we think are reasonable, achievable, feasible, and then invite community members, invite stakeholder interests, other local partners to come and work through that in a half-day workshop to say, okay, this is what we think we should achieve. This is where we think we should focus our efforts. This is what the community really wants to achieve. And these are our priorities. And so that way we can really narrow the scope to say, okay, this is the short list of projects that we're really going to focus our energy on planning for. And so that's that last bullet point there, outlining potential resilience activities. All right, so the last part of our meeting here this morning, and we're doing okay on time, I think, is to start talking about, start brainstorming how we might approach assessing resilience needs. So there's no one way to do this. There's many different ways in the literature that we might approach this. But I thought the first thing that we might do is just have a somewhat guided conversation here, a brainstorming session to say, okay, this is what we know. This is what you all know has been done in Tillamook County, needs to be done in Tillamook County, needs to be better understood. So really trying to identify where are the gaps here that we can include in this process. So to that end, to help structure this a little bit, in 2012, the National Research Council produced a disaster resilience report. and they assess challenges to national resilience from a disaster perspective. I'm going to caveat this a little bit to say, a lot of this talk, there's a big overlap with disaster as well, and hazards, and resilience isn't always about disaster or even necessarily hazards. Sometimes it's just, well, we want to improve habitat quality or something to that effect. It isn't always tied specifically to a disaster or these kinds of things, but often that's the context of the discussions. So just keep that in mind, that really what our focus is estuarine resilience against some of those known hazards that we do have. So the 4 dimensions that they identified in that report that were critical to evaluating resilience are listed here on the screen. So it's vulnerable populations, so factors that capture special needs of individuals and groups that are related to components such as minority status, health issues, mobility, and especially socioeconomic status. 2, critical and environmental infrastructure. So the ability of critical and environmental infrastructure to recover from an event. So the components might include water and sewage, transportation, power, communications, and then they include natural infrastructure within this, as they're kind of like, these things are critical. So it kind of gets confusing sometimes with number 4, built infrastructure, I think, but keep in mind that that critical infrastructure could be built or natural, but what unites it is that it's critical. So 3, social factors. So this is things that enhance or limit a community's ability to recover, including components such as social capital, education, language, governance, financial structures, culture, and the workforce. And then 4, of course, built infrastructure. So this is what's always on most people's minds when they're thinking about hazards or thinking about disasters. They're thinking about the built infrastructure. It's very easy to evaluate. It's very easy to quantify. It's very easy to assign dollar values to these kinds of things, whereas some of these other elements here, not as straightforward to do that. So of course, built infrastructure, in this context, we're looking at the ability of it to withstand impacts from disasters, including components such as hospitals, local government, emergency response facilities, schools, homes and businesses, bridges, roads, these kinds of things. Things that you might think of would be considered critical infrastructure, but for this purposes of this report, that's not what they did. And so, using these 4 factors, I think can help us structure some thinking about how we might identify and define and evaluate needs within Tillamook County that are tied to the estuaries. So we might not evaluate each of these factors or every factor within these 4 dimensions equally, and that's totally fine. But our process is likely to benefit from inclusion of each of these dimensions to some extent in our process. So I thought it would be just a good way to spur some discussion. So what I would like to do with our remaining time is go through each of these dimensions kind of one by one, talk about what we know has already been done, and I have some of that on the slides here, and then where we can identify some opportunities to add value to each of these dimensions within our process. So if everybody's prepared to do that for however long it takes us to talk about it, or until 11 o'clock, that's what I'd like to do with the remainder of our time. Are there any questions there? You're all so quiet this morning. I think I need more coffee as well, though. All right, so I'd like to talk about the first one of those dimensions then. So on the left, I have here some factors for Tillamook County that have already been assessed within this dimension of vulnerable populations. So if TEP in their plans, they did evaluate to some extent community education and engagement. They were focused on things like STEM literacy and career opportunity programs, environmental awareness and stewardship programs. And then in the Tillamook Multi-Jurisdictional Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, they also looked at population factors, community profiles, and housing. So these are all things that fall within vulnerable populations or that might help us evaluate resilience needs for vulnerable populations. So what other opportunities can we identify here to add value to what's already been done that we might consider in our process to help structure how we define our needs, concerns, and priorities?
Would this just be thinking of human populations or?
Yes, vulnerable populations, so factors that capture special needs of particular groups of people related to things like minority status, health issues, mobility, socioeconomic status, etc.
So are you saying that maybe if the stuff that we do, that we would do it in maybe more than one language so that we, so our reports are more out communicating with the public, that we're meeting more than just the English speaking communities of Tillamook County? Is that what you mean?
Not necessarily. I'm thinking more of what are some understanding what the vulnerabilities in Tillamook County are, what the needs and concerns in Tillamook County are, and how we might address those through resilience action. How might we, what are some factors in Tillamook County that we might take into consideration when prioritizing or identifying those actions? So we can say, well, there's, let's say a mobile home park in an area that is at high risk for flooding. So we might say that, this particular location, we should look into seeing what kinds of actions we might be able to do to address that, because that might be a higher priority than an area that's equally prone to flooding, but let's say it's an industrial district or something like that.
So today they have actually are evacuating the Wilson River RV Park at milepost, what is that, milepost 3 on Highway 6. So they are being evacuated as a result of the flood today. So
And the one down in Nescoin too.
yeah. So what's going on in Nescoin, Mike?
Same thing, just flooding, and they were getting people out of the RV park down there. They had about 50 to 60 people to evacuate down there.
Could we start by just looking at the places that frequently flood in Tillamook County and then branch out from there? Like, what are those most vulnerable places that flood every year, and then those landowners or those communities that are in those spots?
So I'd like to follow up on what Colin, when he was presenting the Tillamook River Wetland Project. So currently right now, Burton Fraser Road, I'm sure, is closed, that it is underwater right now. So today's a perfect day for looking at our flooding issues.
So Moses, so I don't know, for me, I'm just having a hard time putting these into categories, because for me, I've been looking at the flow. Tillamook County talks all the time about flooding here, flooding there. It's always about water where it's not supposed to be and no water where it's supposed to be kind of issues. And it's all tied together into a singular need of flow. I mean, it starts with the project we've been working on with the Corps to the jetties, all the way up to tide gates and other barriers. So, and as we break it into these, and I know what we're getting at here, I'm kind of having a hard time just pulling it into separate categories. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I struggle with that myself as well. So it's totally fine if we're not sure where it fits. This is just kind of initial brainstorming, and it's something that we'll kind of refine over time. So I totally feel you, though. It's really hard to separate these issues sometimes.
Well, it is. So, in the things we used to look at, I was doing hazard mitigation down in Morro Bay, California. And one of the things we were looking at for flooding, like RV parks, list looked just like this, is working with farmers to breach levees so that we can flood farm fields, because it's easier and cheaper for FEMA to reimburse them than it is for infrastructure. And that kind of falls into these kind of categories as well.
Yeah, that's right. I totally hear you. Heather, you want to talk about your comment in the chat?
Sure. So I was just, as everyone was talking and again, thinking about, vulnerable populations and what that means for a planning process like this. Things that I think could be helpful to explore, as part of this would be where vulnerable populations are located. How would this be incorporated into the prioritization process? Also looking at economic considerations. So, what are the primary industries in that area? And specifically, what are those that are water dependent? So fisheries and things like that. And another one was public access. And how could that be addressed, and specifically with the idea of providing public access to vulnerable populations, those that might not necessarily use that right, or or even experience marine waters. So those are just kind of some ideas off the top of my head, that immediately came to mind.
So in 2015, we had a big storm event here, and we had 3 catastrophic road failures at that time. One at Harborview Drive in Garibaldi, we had Bay Ocean Drive out over by Memaloose Park, and there was one down in South County, where basically communities became isolated, emergency, so it was basically undersized culverts. So working with the Salmon Superhighway, and, working through FEMA and federal highways is to actually, they all became, $500,000, $1 million projects where you're replacing old infrastructure, maybe putting new bridges in, but then you're dealing with fist passage issues. You're making the community more resilient to these future flood events. So maybe that's something that you're talking about. I know Tillamook County bought a temporary bridge that is sitting in their yard. So when they have these issues, communities isolated, then they can put in a temporary bridge relatively quickly. So I think, and it's hard to see where all our failing infrastructure is. But as far as culverts, I think that the Salmon Superhighway, Tillamook County, that they've got an idea of where some of these vulnerabilities are.
All right. Thank you.
So I
Alright.
had a thought. I'm not 100% sure if it belongs here, but when Heather was talking about, like vulnerable economic populations, I immediately was thinking about, in terms of resilience, some of the, shell fisheries and ocean acidification. I'm thinking about Netarts Bay, and what, if anything, could be done to try and combat ocean acidification, create microcosms of less acidic and deoxygenated water coming in there through maybe like seagrass beds, something like that. So
Yeah, that's an issue near and dear to my heart. I did my graduate work at the Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery in Netarts, so I'm very familiar with those issues, and my job was to monitor the incoming seawater and for ocean acidification issues. So.
Well, another thing, when you talk about shellfish, you're also talking, like I said earlier, everything ties together. We have flooding in Tillamook, we have flooding in the fields, and then it all gets put into the system. And then we have contamination of shellfish, which happens very regularly here in Tillamook Bay, which shuts that industry down for a good chunk of time. The one I was thinking of too is, we keep going all these ones, but it's really economics of I'm losing my wording here. Somebody's ability to evacuate, because we have folks that just don't have the financial resources sometimes, or the medical ability. Every time we have power outages, we have folks that are, susceptible because they're on breathing machines or other stuff. We have tons of people, going back to RV parks, that live in RV parks and they have an RV there, but they don't own a truck big enough to tow the camper out of there when it's time to evacuate. So the economic status of individuals' ability to evacuate or clear out of something.
Yeah, I think that, when we're talking about a vulnerable population, I think that that might be the single most important thing. Can you get out of there and avoid the hazard? So thank you, Mike. That's a great point. So that's something, again, we'll keep these things in mind as we go through the process and ask ourselves, all right, so how do we identify where these populations are? How do we assess for their ability to evacuate and these kinds of things, so it's going to be up to us to kind of figure out how we want to represent that in the final report. So that's great.
So one of the things I don't truly understand is the accretion and erosion of sands along our beaches. So I know that sometimes it's eroding in Neskowin where houses might be vulnerable falling in the ocean, and it's accreting, that sand is moving up to Rockaway Beach and adding sand. So, I don't understand how our sands move up and down the coast, but I know that has been an issue before, and it probably still is.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
got you on that one, Leanne. I've got that one down deep because that's directly tied to our jetties, and because the sand naturally flows up and down, and all the jetties have limited that ability for its natural return. And one of the things we're working on, I don't mean to go off base here, but we're working with the Corps right now to restore a bunch of that sand at Rockaway Beach when they dredge the Tillamook Bay Bar. And part of that is that the wave actions, because it's so deep right there, just been beating the heck out of the coast, which is causing that erosion. Most people remember 20 years ago, we had dunes before you get to the beach from Rockaway. Now those are gone. If we don't do anything 20 years from now, we won't even have Highway 101. So we're working with the Corps to create a new reef off of there with the sand sediment to break up that wave action. So that stuff's all in motion, but I can get you some more on that later too.
I added a comment, but just considering language barriers is an obvious one. I would think that Spanish would probably be the second most commonly used language. So making sure outreach materials and meetings have the opportunity for, Spanish interpretation. And then, we've got the resources of the different community groups that the creamery we support, like Tillamook Care, Community Action Resources group, and other, social service groups that could help us be connected to these vulnerable populations. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of times they know the locations of communities that might have some of these challenges.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and
tourism too. It's something that we've all been working on, but you get a lot of campers and a lot of people that are from outside the area. Having communications with them and their knowledge is important.
Yeah, and one other too that we might keep in mind would be tribal nations. So that's folks that we have a lot of potential to coordinate with, reach out to at many points in this process. So they might be other folks to keep in mind.
So Jocelyn triggered me, we actually have a shelter, unsheltered or homeless problem here in Tillamook County. A lot of them are up camping in our forest. They're up behind Bay City. And I don't know, if any of you driven through Portland recently and seen the problems there, and they're shipping them here. So how do we, is that the vulnerable population that we need to also consider with some of our resiliency plans?
Yep. Absolutely, thank you. All right, well, I don't want to spend too much time on one focus area, and I want to try and work through each of these. So I'm going to go to the next one, and we can talk about critical and environmental infrastructure. So again, this is, things that it's going to be water and sewage, transportation networks, power, communications, as well as natural infrastructure that already exists. So you can see it on the left, some of what's already been done. Oh, I need to change my slide for you. There we go. So, TEP's captured some of this in their planning with key habitats, water quality, erosion, sedimentation, flooding, and others as well have captured a lot of that. The Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, of course, really focuses on a lot of these kinds of things. So they evaluated communities' susceptibility with fire departments, airports, water plants, ports, and many others. So this is often, I think, one of the bigger focuses of these kinds of efforts, but I thought we'd throw it out there to see what else we might be able to include or consider in our process for addressing needs. Mike says the jetties, of course.
I'd say dike maintenance, drainage district type work.
It was mentioned before, but seeing farmlands as an asset to the watershed and possibly engaging with farmers if, hey, could we use your land in case of emergency for overflow, or we don't need really groundwater recharge, but I know in a lot of arid areas they have groundwater recharge basins on ag lands.
I think I would count that as natural infrastructure, probably, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, one that I keep looking at too is, it's a hot topic for us at the port, is the need to continue, the need to dredge. And every time we get areas like you have over around Memaloos, we don't have, this comes back to water flow issue, but the Port of Garibaldi, our boat basin has sand and sediment getting packed in there from Miami and these other ones. And we have to dredge it every couple of years. We've been wanting to find ways to help mitigate sediment deposit, because if we can mitigate sediment deposit in certain areas, then we're going to limit the amount of dredging we have to do, which is both an economical and an environmental benefit if we don't have to dredge as much. So being able to mitigate sediment deposits where they're an impact to water flow is an issue.
Yeah, I was just in a meeting the other day with our folks down in Coos County, and it was very interesting. They were saying that the last 2 years in Coos Bay, the amount of material that they've dredged out has been just a fraction of what they typically would do. And they honestly were not sure why that is, why there's so much less sediment being deposited in Coos Bay. So I'm curious if similar things are happening in other ports.
Well, there's a lot, you've got, back in the day, they used to do a lot of the gravel mining in the rivers and the creeks and a lot of that stuff, it wasn't natural, but there was a lot of flow. And then we had the Tillamook burn that sent a lot of sediment down over the last, before it was all fixed. So flow, I think, is what changed over the decades.
Yeah.
So an opportunity is the city of Bay City is working, heading into, in fact, with DLCD phase 2 of our ordinance development. So can we now put ordinances in to manage stormwater better? Our stuff is pretty old, so there's an opportunity there. And also, talking about the fires, we had the Pike Road fire last year, so do we do something with the urban wildlands fire?
Yeah. All right. Any others for critical or environmental infrastructure?
Well, we already touched on tide gates and culverts a bit, but having right-sized structures for road stream crossings where you have the right ability to convey flow in high water events is an important opportunity for resilience, keeping roads open, minimizing flooding when water's backing up behind clogged culverts. And also just thinking about sediment and thinking about forest management as well, and how that might impact sediment loading in the streams as well.
So could we maybe say connectivity? Would that kind of be an umbrella? And then maybe I'll say with upland in particular, because like you're saying, these culverts and stuff, if they're clogged or damaged, then we don't have that connectivity. with the upland. And so that's going to have effects going both ways. All right. So next, social factors. So again, so this is going to be a little more broad than vulnerable populations, and it's going to be things that enhance or limit a community's ability to recover. So components like social capital, education, language, governance, financial structures, culture, and workforce. So I think Jocelyn had mentioned language, so maybe this is here where we will put that one down, because I don't think that any of these other efforts have looked at that aspect of resilience. So maybe that's something that we can include.
So we're all working on the efforts for the Salmonberry Trail. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Salmonberry Trail, Rails and Trails. You know, is there an opportunity to build resilience in the designs, especially like the section coming around Garibaldi, Barview to Garibaldi? So, you know, are there opportunities there to combine and build synergy on projects that are already moving forward?
So let's see, maybe coordination, maybe. That's where I'm really in the dark on a lot of that. So that, thank you, Leanne. Like a lot of those projects, past, present, and future, I'm not as familiar with. So that's where a lot of you folks can really inform me on how we can link all these things together. Casey, I saw you mentioned in the chat, consider access to livelihood, workforce access to critical operations. So I think that that fits nicely within this this category here. So DEP did some of this work with their education and outreach kind of outlook, and with the factors, the elements listed there, as well as they were focused on developing capacity. I think capacity is a big one for a lot of organizations, you know, state agencies included. So, and then planning and policy, of course. You can't really do planning and policy without staff capacity to do planning and policy. And then we also had some other plans look at education outreach, estuary policy, and then schools was looked at in the National Hazard Mitigation Plan. So any other opportunities here for us?
What about recreation?
Oh, yeah.
You know, for the social factors.
Absolutely.
I was going to bring up, just along with that, is tourism as well, and that's one thing we found over the last few years. We knew it was coming, but creating creating places for them, because if the tourists coming, like we saw over the last couple of years, they're going to make trails where they want to make trails. They're going to go to the bathroom where they want to go to the bathroom. But creating facilities that help support that is huge.
Yeah, and I imagine that, you know, given the course of the pandemic and you know, if things are returning back to normal before next summer, I can't even imagine what the tourist season next summer is going to be like on the Oregon coast. So, all right.
On the tourism note.
Go ahead, Zach.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say on the tourism note, one piece is facilities, of course, but also educating people about how to behave when dispersed camping and all that sort of thing. That was something that we talked about with the Explore Nature programming and trying to get some of that messaging pushed out, but I don't think anything ever came of that.
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, that's a great point, Zach, because awareness. I think awareness is a big one. Because, you know, let's say we have an issue that's tourism related, and it's impacting the estuary in a negative way, and maybe it's something that could be improved through education and outreach and awareness efforts. And you know, sometimes that can be a very cost-effective solution to it. Other times we know that it doesn't always work. People don't always read signs or abide by rules or expectations, but that's something that I think that's very good outside the box thinking when it comes to resilience. So thank you.
There was a big planning effort by I think it's the Oregon Coast Tourism Association. I can't remember exactly what their organization is called, but for, just kind of to address that issue, many issues with tourism, but one of them being sustainability and minimizing impacts. So probably try to loop them in or get our hands on that report that came out of that.
Sure.
You have ACFA, which is them, and then I think the local partner should be Visit Tillamook Coast, VTC, which is run by Nan Devlin, and they're very active with that exact message here in the county.
Great, thank you. All right, well, before we run out of time here, go ahead.
I have one more thought. You were talking about in the previous slide about how Coos Bay's noticed the less deposit of sediment over the last few years, and it just occurs to me that we're so inundated in water right now. We're always thinking about the floods, but the last few seasons it's been so dry. We haven't been getting much rain, and that's kind of how the sediment moves. But it occurred to me while we're talking about resilience, one of the problems we're having, I guess, due to climate change is that the water that we're getting, it's reduced and it's hot, and that affects the habitat, of course. I don't know what it does to people, but it's something I guess we need to think about as we're going through this.
Yeah, water stress likely to be an increasing issue in the future for sure. So, it seems like the problem is always either we have too much water in the wrong place or not enough.
Moses,
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, up here in North County, we had, water conservation notices at the end of the summer because our drinking water, our, water supplies were really low. And that's the first time I've experienced that since I've been living on the coast. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that in the future.
So my question, Moses, are we going to be, every time I sit on hazard mitigation things, everybody talks about the Cascadia subduction zone events, and they forget about the things that happen every year, like the winds and the storms and the fires. And we should probably at some point somewhere in here also not just focus on flooding, but how is our estuary prepared for extreme wind events? How is our estuary prepared for fire events and those types of things as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll add that one to the natural infrastructure slide.
I think related to this too, and it might overlap with other ones, but is recreational. I guess that's, well, you've got recreation, but I was thinking Tillamook County Wellness, they're a major coordinator of different groups, and they are introducing this Blue Zones project, which is mostly focused on health and longevity, but I think it overlaps a lot with exercise and recreation. So I just wanted to mention that project that they're going to be bringing in to the area, which is, it could be a really big boost to the local, planning efforts as well.
Okay.
So I guess my ad would be health and healthcare related to recreation.
Okay.
I have just like one small thing that I've been chewing on also related to recreation. It's also recreation and sort of calling back to the initial part of your presentation when looking at maybe socioeconomic or sort of financial outcomes of like restoration work. We got a socioeconomic report for impacts of the Southern Flow Corridor. And one of the potentially large impacts, we weren't tracking it, but one of them was recreation at the Southern Flow Corridor restoration site. And I know Sickus Edge has tons of people going out there all the time. And I just think recreation might be something to consider in any like projects that you do. Can you build in a wildlife viewing zone over a wetlands? Can you, talking like what Mike was saying, can you put some facilities in there? Like these are interesting areas. Can you actually do that? Can you actually make it accessible to folks for recreation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's certainly something to be said for the strategy of of, well, the tourists are going to come, where do we want to send them? Are we going to concentrate them all in certain areas, or are we going to spread out the impact there? And so I think any sort of resilience planning would have to consider what the outlook is in the next few decades.
Visit
Celeste?
Tillamook Coast just hired, brought in Dan Hagg. He used to be with North Coast Rec District, and he is the trails coordinator for Tillamook County for Visit Tillamook Coast. And that's one issue that he's talking about right now and looking at is where strategically do all these access points need to be for people, which ties right into this.
Great. All right, well, Celeste also has a great comment in the chat there. I encourage you to read it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward here and just spend just a minute or two. If we got anything on built infrastructure, I think it's okay if we spend a little less time on this one because it's not really the focus of this process, and built infrastructure is, I think there's plenty of concern there for most folks, but there might be some way that we could, for example, minimize or mitigate impacts to built infrastructure by, natural infrastructure projects, of course, redirecting floodwaters and such. So was there any kind of added value opportunities here for built infrastructure considerations?
Well, I think the infrastructure package that Congress just passed last week is a huge opportunity for funding. So getting our act together, identifying these projects, there's money out there for the next 5 to 10 years. So this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know DLCD in particular, we should expect to see some of that as well. So that's going to help everybody moving forward.
I think one of the things that I've been glad to see when we do these culverts and bridges is there's a requirement in the permit to do some planting, which is nice. They just kind of soften them. I don't know if there's more that could be done there policy-wise.
I'll say like planting, and it's kind of under the category of restoration efforts to complement some of that work.
So I just was reading our water master plan, and our water master plan calls for another $1.5 million reservoir. In fact, the creamery cheese factory, they use 50% of the water that Bay City produces. And so that actually states, we should be building a reservoir close to the cheese factory as part of our future planning for growth and resiliency of our whole water system.
So water storage sounds very important. Yeah, and I know
that's important in the uplands too. I know that the forest is a huge sponge, but if we could do more projects to boost that, I think it would help us in the long run too, to have cooler streams and more water in the summer.
Okay,
those cooler streams are also super important from the TEP, just like habitat restoration, resilience for our native species as climate shifts, and maybe we get some invasive species from the south. So making sure we have resilient habitat just from the natural dimension as well.
Would this be a place where you might think about where you need to remove built infrastructure, not necessarily protect it?
Yeah, absolutely. So things like I had mentioned, removal of tide gates. I don't imagine culverts get removed too often rather than replaced, but yeah, things like that, absolutely. Or even, there's probably places that would benefit from removing things like riprap or other hardened infrastructure along the coast. All right, well, we're just about out of time here, so I don't want to keep people too long. So just my last slide here for everybody is what's next. So I think we've kind of figured out a regular meeting day and time. So I will set that up and send something out to everybody, and then we can just expect that you know, on a monthly basis, we'll get together. We'll just provide updates, say, hey, this is where we're at. This is what I got for you. This is what I could really use your feedback on. So on occasion, we'll expect some emails and some documents to review. Again, this whole process is voluntary. So if ever it's just too much, just let me know. Do what you can. The other important thing that's part of that I wanted to remind everybody is I did send out a spreadsheet early on to say, use this to track your hours. So we have to report we have a one-to-one match obligation for NIFWIF. So we need to report annually what the contributions have been. So for our process, that's the majority of those contributions are just going to be in-kind staff match, so i.e. your time. So please keep track of that, and then I'll collect that from you on occasion so that we can report it to NIFWIF. So, you know, 2 hours this morning and any other time that you've spent doing this. So next month, my aim is to get some sort of draft summary of the planning that we talked about here, the local context for resilience we talked about here. And if anything else comes to mind, please send it to me. Additional information about the things that we discussed here. So we want to start to kind of encapsulate that into our resilience needs assessment to say, this is what we know has been planned for, this is what we know is going on, and this is where these are the areas that we've identified that we can add value to that, include these things, evaluate the vulnerabilities here, and that'll help us describe and paint that picture of these are the local needs and concerns. So be thinking about that, where we can add value, the potential approaches to do that and to address gaps. So I'm going to try and send some things to you folks here in the next month or so that will help us think about, you know, how do we want to do that? Do we want community listening sessions? And how might those look like? Who might we include on that so that at the end of phase 1, which will be sometime early in next year, that we will have kind of this, we've assessed all of our needs and concerns and we've represented those in the way that we think is appropriate for our phase 1 product. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate that. I appreciate all your input. This has really been great from my understanding of what's going on in Tillamook. I'm available anytime you need, phone, text, email, Zoom, whatever, and Heather as well. So if you have any questions here before we adjourn, now's your chance. Otherwise, I'll say thank you, and I really appreciate your time again.
Thank you, Moses. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. We'll see you again next month.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.